The 22nd of December 1849, St. Petersburg. The temperature that day was 4 degrees below zero. The sky was a typical Russian pale gray, hanging so low it felt like it might crush the buildings beneath it. By 7 a.m., Semyonov Square had already been completely surrounded by troops. The snow was thick. Stepping on it produced a sharp, piercing crunch. 24 carriages slowly rolled into the square. The men escorted out of them were a group of young state criminals. Most were only in their 20s. Their faces were pale, their eyes a mix of fear, confusion, and a naive, scholarly bewilderment. This group was known as the Dostoevsky Circle. What heinous crime had they committed? Assassinating the Tsar, blowing up a palace? No. They simply gathered to read banned books from France, discuss Fourier's utopian socialism, and curse the rottenness of serfdom. Among them was a 28-year-old retired engineering lieutenant named Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. He had just published his debut novel, Poor Folk, and was hailed by the literary world as a brilliant rising star. He thought he was going to be the next Gogol. But now, fate was playing a massive cruel joke on him. The judge read the verdict. For disseminating harmful ideas and attempting to subvert the state order, you are sentenced to death, to be carried out immediately. Death. That word tore through the freezing air like a bullet. Up until that moment, these young men naively believed the Tsar would, at worst, sentence them to exile or a few years of hard labor. After all, they were just intellectuals, unarmed and powerless. But now, looking at the 3 rough wooden posts, erected in the center of the square, and the cold-faced soldiers loading their muskets, they finally realized this was not a drill. We are going to die. In this extreme, biting cold, the executioner issued a cruel order: take off your coats. To allow the condemned to die with dignity, or rather, to humiliate them, they had to strip off their warm overcoats and put on thin, white shrouds. At that moment, the cold no longer mattered. Their bodies were shivering not just from the freezing temperature, but from the primal trembling of their souls. Next came the ritual of civil death. The executioner walked over and forcefully snapped several swords, symbols of their noble status, right above their heads. Crack. This meant that even before their physical death, they were already dead in the eyes of society. No titles, no names, just bodies waiting for the slaughter. A priest approached with a cross, offering them their final confession. Dostoevsky kissed the cross. Looking into the priest's eyes, he must have thought of Christ on the cross at that very moment. But he said nothing. In the face of this massive, absurd state machine, words had lost all meaning. The prisoners were divided into groups of 3. The first 3 men were already tied to the posts. White hoods were pulled over their heads, covering their faces. This meant they were only seconds away from death. Dostoevsky was in the second group. He stood in the snow, watching his comrades ahead being tied up. He had about 5 minutes left. These 5 minutes would later be chewed over and regurgitated in his mind endlessly. They would become Prince Mishkin's famous monologue in The Idiot, and Raskolnikov's nightmare in Crime and Punishment. In the mind of this 28-year-old, time suddenly stretched, becoming viscous and heavy. He meticulously divided the use of these last 5 minutes. 2 minutes to say goodbye to his friends beside him. 2 minutes to reflect one last time on who he was. And the final minute to take one last look at the world. He turned his head and said to Pleshaev beside him, "We shall be with Christ." Pleshaev, a staunch atheist, smiled bitterly and replied, "Just dust to dust." The farewells were over. He began to think, I am still here. I am still myself. But in 3 minutes, what will I become? Where will I be? Or will it be absolute nothingness? This dread of non-existence drove him far madder than any physical pain ever could. Finally, he cast his gaze into the distance. Though the morning sunlight was thin, it happened to strike the golden dome of a nearby church. The dome gleamed in the sun, stinging his eyes. He stared fixedly at that golden light. He felt it was his final connection to this world. That light seemed to have a life of its own. It was the eternity he was about to merge with. And right at that moment, a thought struck him like lightning. What if I don't die? What if I live? Then I would turn every single minute into an entire century. I wouldn't waste a single second. I would spend my whole life calculating the value of that 1 minute. It was the greed for life of a dying man, a desperate, extravagant hope. The soldiers facing the first group raised their rifles. Ready! The executioner's shout rang across the square. Dozens of dark muzzles aimed at the 3 hooded men on the posts. The drummers began to roll their snares. That rapid, intense drumbeat sounded exactly like the footsteps of the Grim Reaper. At this very moment, standing in the second row, Dostoevsky's heart was about to pound out of his chest. He watched those rifles. He knew that in the next second, with a flash of fire, those 3 men would collapse like ragged sacks. Then, the soldiers would reload. Then, someone would drag him forward and tie him to that same post, still warm and stained with blood. The hood would go on, that darkness, that agonizing split second, waiting for the bullet to shatter his skull. This psychological torture far exceeded death itself. One of the prisoners beside him, Grigoriev, snapped completely in that instant. Even though he survived, he went permanently insane, never to recover his reason. The drums stopped. The executioner raised his hand, ready to drop it for the final command. Fire! Right at the very last second, a carriage rushed madly into the square. The driver waved a white handkerchief, screaming, "Stop! Stop!" by order of the Tsar. The rifles were lowered. A deathly silence blanketed the square. An officer rode forward, pulled out a document, and read aloud. By His Imperial Majesty's boundless grace, your lives are spared. Your sentence is commuted to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, followed by military conscription. It was a play. An entirely, meticulously orchestrated, malicious theatrical act. Tsar Nicholas I never intended to execute them from the very beginning. But he felt that simple exile wasn't enough to educate these rebellious youths. He wanted to shatter their will. He wanted them to taste death firsthand, to walk them right up to the gates of hell, and then pull them back like a benevolent god. He wanted them to remember his imperial mercy, and that bone-deep terror every single day for the rest of their lives. Weeping broke out among the men. Some collapsed into the snow, others laughed hysterically. Dostoevsky stood there, perfectly still. In that moment, the sentimental literary youth who wrote Poor Folk died. That wooden post, that hood, those rifles, they killed the naive idealist. The man who survived was a monster who had acquired the perspective of a dead man. 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, Dostoevsky was shackled in 10-pound leg irons and forced onto a sled bound for Siberia. At the transit station in Tobolsk, the wives of the Decembrists visited them. They gave Dostoevsky a single item, a copy of the New Testament. Hidden inside the binding was a 10-ruble note. This Bible became the only book he was permitted to read during his 4 years of hard labor in Siberia. In that freezing, flea-infested, stench-filled prison camp packed with criminals, he read it thousands of times. He even used it to teach illiterate inmates how to read. He looked at the real murderers, robbers, and rogue soldiers around him. The old hymn would have looked down on these poor folk with a sense of lofty pity. But now, he was one of them. He began to dissect their souls, dissecting the twisted mad, yet occasionally divine humanity forged in such extreme conditions. He remembered that morning on the execution grounds. He remembered the light striking the golden dome. Life is a gift. Life is happiness. Every minute can be an eternity of happiness. 4 years of hard labor, 6 years of military service. When he finally returned to St. Petersburg and picked up his pen again, a chill went down the spine of the entire Russian literary world. He no longer wrote tender, sentimental tales. He wrote The House of the Dead, documenting that hell. He wrote Crime and Punishment, putting an axe in Raskolnikov's hands. He wrote The Idiot, having Prince Mishkin tell the story of a condemned man. He wrote The Brothers Karamazov, interrogating the very existence of God. On that morning in 1849, the Tsar thought he was merely terrifying a disobedient young lieutenant. He had no idea he was forging one of the most terrifying giants in literary history. That 5-minute near-death experience was planted in Dostoevsky's brain like a radioactive seed. It gave him an X-ray vision that could pierce through the human soul. He saw through humanity's deepest fears, lowest desires, and most psychotic sins. In the years that followed, he would often bring up that moment. It wasn't just a personal turning point. It was a singularity in the history of human spirit. Because from that day forward, literature was no longer merely a mirror reflecting life. Literature became that snapped sword, that blood-stained wooden post, that Bible with the hidden rubles. It began to stare into the abyss, on behalf of all mankind,